It's your meme. Boys and girls of every age, how would you like to see? Whoa, wait, it's wouldn't you like to see? Something strange. Basically, I don't know what it was about Victorian era, but most of like weird shit is usually Victorian. Like usually when I see something really weird and old, 9 out of 10 cases is from Victorian era. And I mean like home decoration, fashion, like they just had so many grotesque things and I'm not sure why. There's just something about like Victorian aesthetic that's like so kitsch, grimy and weird sometimes that I absolutely adore. That is why today we're going to delve into weird things they did with fashion. Some of them are a bit overrated. I mean, sometimes you hear those things about Victorian era and you tend to believe those things just because it was a long time ago and we don't really know what happened, and you know, anything that's weird seems believable, but it's not always the case, and there's a lot of stereotype, including for example corsets, that we tend to believe nowadays that weren't as bad as we think they were. But some of those things actually existed, and I mean if you look at them nowadays it's kind of gross. So I'm gonna start off with things they didn't know were wrong, and that for example was using arsenic as a coloring, for example in clothes or like wallpapers. It's weird because they knew it was kind of connected, like you had those cases of people dying because they worked with arsenic, but for some reason it didn't quite click. So there is this shade of green that's called Shields green, and it was basically arsenic, and the pigment was used as a coloring pigment. Is pigment always coloring? Anyway, so obviously that doesn't sound like a great idea, but back then it didn't really, like there was a lot of chemicals that they didn't really check before they used them, so they were just wearing arsenic dresses. So obviously that is not the best idea they ever had. And it's not like anyone who wore a dress like that died instantly. It's more about gradually intoxicating your body, and if you really liked that shade of green and if you surrounded yourself with items like that, for example your wallpapers might get wet, there is just some kind of chemical reaction that can lead to you breathing in those chemicals, and it doesn't have to be that big amount of arsenic to kill you. So that is why you could literally be dressed to kill yourself. So that's one thing. Again, I think nowadays it's a bit stereotyped because it's such a ridiculous thing, like why would you dye your clothes with arsenic, but I'm not sure to what extent it was actually used and to what extent it actually caused people to die, literally. But it sure affected their health heavily, as if there weren't enough things in 19th century that could easily kill you. So another thing, which is kind of gross but it's also kind of cool, depending on how you see using insects as a form of decoration. So basically there was this trend to decorate your dresses with beetles. Not beetles as in like whole bugs, but they use beetle wings that actually look really cool, and I can kind of see why, because it looks like the color is really vibrant.
Stop it. Get some help.
Oh my god, this is so good. Okay, so when I first heard about this, I was kind of like, that sounds gross. Like, why would you use pieces of insects to decorate your dress? And like, what form can it even have? Like, are you gonna just put a huge beetle on your chest? Or like, are you gonna use the legs and like put them in some sort of ornaments? That sounds disgusting. But then I saw the actual dresses and boy was I hooked. Like, they look amazing. Basically, you can't really tell that those used to be insects or like bugs, and just the color is so vibrant and it's so pretty, and it's also shiny. It's kind of like 19th century glitter, so I can't really blame them for wanting to use those kind of decorations. The other thing though is that a lot of people did it, so I can only imagine that it must have affected the population of those types of beetles in 19th century, but then that's not the only animal that was affected by 19th century fashion, which I'm gonna discuss in a bit. What was that? That's the kind of like a gross Victorian trend that I can approve of because it looks gorgeous. And they used it very often on those like white cotton dresses where you could really clearly see all the decoration and stuff. It was kind of like a really nice contrast. And the funny thing is, you can still buy those yourself nowadays because they're still used as decorations sometimes. Basically, the way they did this is they had the wings and they had to, you know, drill a hole inside the wing, and then they would just kind of what was that? It's not even funny. And they would just use them as sort of beads, and they would just, you know, sew them onto the dress. So another thing, it's not really that disgusting, it's just so weird. So basically in Victorian era, you witness a lot of people die during your lifetime. Like, it was a norm to lose like 4 of your own children and then lose your husband when you're like 31 or something. And it was pretty common to basically die. No, but really, like, when you look at the statistics, the children just died like flies. It was really uncommon for you to reach what we nowadays call an old age, and basically if you read Victorian books it's very common to call someone who's like 40 an old lady. So it was really different back then, and because death surrounded you, it was just such a common thing that you tended to be in mourning a lot. And that's why Victorian mourning fashion was so complex, and it was, you know, you had every detail sorted out because it was a huge part of your life. Sooner or later, you're gonna have to wear mourning. Back then, it was like a whole ritual that took months and years, and you had different phases of it, you had different symbols. It also affected the fashion. So for example, the very first stages of mourning, you know, you had to wear completely black, and then additional colors were added in later. One of those things that were included in those kind of like early stages of mourning were like your own mourning accessories, which is kind of weird, but I think it was for the people that actually missed their loving ones. You know, they felt like it's all properly done and they're respecting them in some way. Whereas for people, I know it sounds terrible, but I think there were plenty of people that were forced to mourn after someone that they didn't necessarily miss. So let's say you were married to a 70-year-old guy and he suddenly died of a heart attack, and then you're forced to wear black for a couple of months and like not participate in any kind of fun events. So I think that's what made it a little bit sweeter, was the fact that you were allowed to have all those fancy mourning accessories. So you'd have special brooches, you would have jewelry, you would have a memorial die cuts, which was something like a sort of like a very pretty card, you know, remembering your beloved one. That leads me to hair jewelry. Like, who wouldn't want to wear a bracelet made of your loved one's hair? But they did it. They used hair and they made jewelry of it. It was considered this kind of like somber type of jewelry, like usually it had something to do with mourning. In Poland, they used hair jewelry after the January uprising failed, and it was kind of like there was this whole mourning fashion trend among Polish women, which was kind of like a political statement, and it was supposed to be like grieving after Poland, basically, the failed attempt to gain independence again. So that's when the hair jewelry was used extensively, but in other countries it was mostly supposed to... It was like a mourning thing, but not always, because I've seen some examples where it clearly has nothing to do with mourning. It was just kind of like a trend. My friend showed me a bag made of hair recently, and as gross as it sounds, it didn't actually look that bad, because when I first heard like hair jewelry, I was kind of like, I imagined this like bracelet with like, you know, like, oh, I'm gonna try and make it. Oh, that's what I imagined, right? And then I googled it and I was like, that's actually really pretty, and you actually really can't tell it's made from hair because it's really intricately done. Sometimes looking at like 19th century handwork, I'm like, there is no way anyone could ever do that nowadays because it's just so tiny, and that's what I feel looking at those hair jewelry pieces. They usually used like small strands of hair and they would just intertwine them to make like nice yeah. But they also used pieces of hair, like not tangled at all, as a form of remembering someone, and that was a really long custom that nowadays if you go to a museum it is very common to just look at someone's piece of hair, basically. Like lock of hair. That was a thing. But most of the time you can't really tell that it's hair because it's just so nicely done. It was used in rings and bracelets. You would have a necklace made of hair that wasn't anything that unusual. You would have earrings with pieces of someone's hair in it. As disgusting as it sounds, that's actually a very like slow fashion content right there. And the very last thing is we're going back to killing animals for fashion. And like when it comes to furs, I kind of understand because they didn't have any artificial sort of fabrics back then. It was impossible to make something warm without using natural ingredients, be it either wool or in the colder temperatures. Fur was the only thing that made you live. So like if you're for example from Poland or Russia and the temperatures were like way below zero most winters, the thing was different when it came to like decoration. A lot of animals died during the 19th century for fashion, but I think the most spectacular example was the way they used birds for their hats. And it wasn't really a thing until, like, it was a thing in the early 19th century when it was popular to like decorate your bonnets with feathers and stuff, but it was like, you know, you had 2 feathers and that was it. But it wasn't until like 1870s and 1880s when it was becoming more and more popular to kind of involve some sort of a piece of animal on your head. So basically you would have either a whole wing, or in some cases, especially in the later 19th century, like 1890s, you would have a whole freaking bird on your head. And like, I'm not saying that's weird, but that's freaking weird. The thing is though, it looks pretty awesome. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I love the effects. It just looks so dope. It's like, I don't know, there's just something about the whole shape and like the whole proportions, but it just looks really cool with the whole silhouette. But the problem was a lot of women started doing it, like not themselves obviously, like they didn't kill birds and put them on their heads, nope. But like, you know, the more women wanted it, the more manufacturers had to kill the birds, and it became an increasing problem. And in the late 19th century there was actually this whole movement, like women against wearing dead birds on their heads, basically. Okay, that wasn't the actual name of the society, but there was a society that was what I would say like grandmas of modern vegans, and they were like, we're killing all the birds, can we stop? And it's cool because it's kind of like, you know, we tend to think they didn't care or like they didn't know anything about it, and then there's this society. And I even read some articles in Polish magazines from the era, like from early 20th century I think that was, where they complained about using too many feathers, and they were kind of like, can we just use flowers instead, because this is getting ridiculous. And I think it's really cool because it shows that in the late 19th century the mindset started to change, and that's what led to what happened in the 20th century. But since we're still talking Victorian, then yes, Victorian women did in fact wear birds on their hats. And it's funny because sometimes they made them look alive, like the way they posed the bird on the hat would suggest it's about to like take off and just fly away. So these are all the disgusting Victorian trends that I wanted to share with you. And I'm pretty sure there's more, there's probably a lot more that I know myself and I forgot about. That's just the way I am. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm gonna go and get some more of these cookies before they're all gone, because that shit was delicious.